Hello, entomology class. Welcome to part B of our module 3, lesson 10 lecture. This is our lecture on the Holometabola. Last time we covered a lot of these. We basically got these groups all taken care of. So now we're just going to hit these last 5: Lepidoptera, Trichoptera, Diptera, Mecoptera, and Siphonaptera. It should be pretty fun. It won't take nearly as long as the first one. And man, those are some pretty terrible circles. Disclaimer, am battling quite the allergies today, so I apologize in advance for that. So the Lepidoptera, lepis means scale and pteron means wing, of course. We've done this over and over and over again. A lot of them have the PTERA ending. So all that coloration that's in there is made up of scales. Little tiny scales. If you zoom way in on a butterfly wing, you can see these scales, and they're just layered over each other, and that makes this amazing coloration that we see in the diversity of butterflies. So that's really cool. There's a whole bunch of them, about 180,000 described species. A lot of them are butterflies, but most of those are actually probably a lot of moths and things like moths that we find. So there's lots of little brown moths that are so hard to identify. They do have some economical importance, pests of crops, a little bit of pollination going on there, and some silk production from the silk producing moths. It's quite an industry that they're known for. So Lepidoptera, like a lot of these others, they co-diversified with the angiosperms. So they evolved the same time as the angiosperms. Angiosperms are all the flowering plants. Over 80% of the plants on the planet are angiosperms. Once they develop these real green leafy structures that are very chewable and edible, as well as flowers full of nectar and pollen, they became a great source of food for insects, especially things like Lepidoptera. So the caterpillars love to eat the leaves and things like that, and we find the adults eating nectar and other parts of and maybe a little bit of pollen, mostly nectar. So they have this relationship of kind of co-evolving with each other. When we talk about plant-insect interactions, I'm going to talk about this a lot more, but it's a really kind of a cool dichotomy of good and bad, the way these two groups interact with each other. So the adults have these siphoning mouth, these siphoning mouth parts. They have a long proboscis that they coil up, and then they extend that down in to a flower to get the nectar out of there. The immatures generally all have chewing mouth parts used to chew up plant material. Now, caterpillars are immature butterflies or moths, and we know those have 6 legs because they're insects. And now you're going to tell me, like, oh, well, caterpillars clearly have more than 6 legs, and they do not. For example, this is a monarch caterpillar. It's got 3 pairs of legs up here, and then it's got all these things down here, which are actually called pseudopeds. They're fake legs. They kind of suction on to things, but they're not actual legs. In fact, some of them, their pro legs aren't even like real legs. They're kind of they're leg structures, but they're not used completely as legs. Almost all butterflies are herbivorous, almost all of them. And most caterpillars are just eating machines. They grow really, really fast. They eat a ton. They excrete a ton while they're eating. And a few caterpillars are cannibalistic, eating other caterpillars if they hatch out a little sooner. Caterpillars are beautiful, and sometimes that is really bad. You're this big blob of juicy goodness that sounds pretty good to eat for a bird or something like that. So a lot of them have protections against that, like these urticating hairs. Like a tarantula has these they're hairs that can come off. They have some irritant in them that can cause a painful rash. Makes things really not want to eat them. And some of them just have more spikes. There's lots of them that have different kinds of poison and things like that in there, just to deter predation. Kind of like we talked about with bees and wasps, what are the differences? We have the same thing going with butterflies and moths. And again, these aren't perfect names. Excuse me. These aren't perfect names because it's not like in the Lepidoptera there's all butterflies in one group and all moths in the other group. It doesn't happen that way perfectly. You can't categorize them that easily. But there are some cool things that are going on. Some of the major differences is resting wings. Butterflies typically rest with their wings closed up together. Moths typically rest with their wings out and flat down. The antennae of butterflies are typically long with a little club on the end. Moths are typically, they have the filiform and plumose. Moths are generally nocturnal and butterflies are generally diurnal. So moths do a lot of location with sense of smell, with their scent gland scent. So that encourages that has them have these much more dynamic antennae for picking up the scents than we find in the butterflies. The coloration typically in butterflies is more bright and beautiful, and moths are often more drab, although I have a couple moths here that are not terribly drab, but they usually hide pretty well. This one's really cool. It's kind of hard to see, but the tip of its wing here is supposed to mimic the head of a snake. You can kind of see it with the eye and the mouth as a scare tactic. Some of them have big eye spots on their hind wings, and they reveal those, and it looks like eyes of an owl to scare away predators. Body shape. Butterflies are long and skinny. Moths are much thicker, more robust, and moths have much better eyes typically than the butterflies do because of the whole nocturnal diurnal thing. Okay, so the next group we're going to talk about are the Trichoptera. Trix meaning hair and pteron meaning wing. So these have a really hairy wings, basically. And one of the ways we know they're most closely related to the butterflies is because the hairs and the scales seem to have the same origin. They look a lot more like hairs in the Trichoptera and a lot more like scales in the Lepidoptera. One of the coolest things about these is that they are aquatic as larvae. So they're holometabola, so they have aquatic larvae, and then of course a pupal stage, and then an adult stage. So they're a lot like the Plecoptera and the Ephemeroptera. They're very, very common in cold streams. They're a little different. They're in these cases usually. We call them rock rollers and things like that, and I'll show you some more in the next slide. They're usually filter feeders, as though some are predators, and they make these cases or other types of cool things under the water that they live in. The adults have their wings held as like a tent over their back. Like I said, have the hairs. So here are some more of the nymphs. So this one, you can see here, it's taken a bunch of little tiny rocks, basically little pieces of sand, and it's made its case out of that. This one's been pulled out of the case. You can see all of the gills that it has for taking oxygen out of the water. This one has made a little case out of little pieces of sticks. This one's out of little pieces of bark, looks like, maybe something like that. And the ones that don't hang out in a case are typically predaceous. So these are part of what they call the EPT metric to assess water quality: Ephemeroptera, Plecoptera, Trichoptera. They're very sensitive to pollutants and other things like that. And so when you do some biomonitoring using insects, Trichoptera is one of the ones that are typically going to be used. All right, the next one is Diptera. Diptera means two wings, right? Di, two, ptera, meaning wing. These are what we call the true flies. So their fore wings are actual wings. Their hind wings are evolved into little halteres. Halteres, we'll talk about in the next one. There's about 150,000 described species. So this is the last of our big four: Hymenoptera, Coleoptera, Lepidoptera, and Diptera. If you don't think what are the big four orders is going to be a question on the exam, then you have not been paying attention very well, because it will be for sure will be a question or two. These are very important ecological roles like pollination, herbivory, hematophagy. They deal with a lot of pollution recycling as well, especially in fecal matter and dead bodies, things like that. So a very, very important group. And you have them all over your house. So their hind wing are these halteres, right? These are those little knobby things. When in flight, they spin and rotate really, really fast. And they probably are used to maintain orientation and velocity. So a gyroscope, you spin this, they're used in planes and things like that to figure out orientation and figure out velocity. They probably do the same thing in Diptera, we think. We don't really know. Here are just a couple of the cool ones. The hoverflies and bee flies, they like to look just like bees. And why not? Things leave bees alone. Most things don't want to mess with a bee. All these are actually flies, and you can tell because they have two wings instead of four wings. But you can also tell after you look at a lot of these things, these are clearly flies with the antennae and the eyes the way they are. But a bird doesn't know that. They don't have books. They don't catalog things. They just see yellow and black and be like, yeah, I don't want any part of that. That looks pretty bad. When we talk about mouth parts, they have some really cool and diverse mouth parts that are kind of messed up sometimes. They have piercing, sucking mouth parts like the mosquitoes that just stick that little stylet into you, suck your blood out. The cutting, sponging mouth parts are very unpleasant, like deer flies and horse flies. They can actually slice your skin a little bit and then suck your blood up, lap your blood up after they kind of create a little wound there. These are the ones on the right, and then the sponging mouth parts like a house fly. Watch one next time. It's maybe a little gross, I don't know. But look at it when it lands on something. Its little mouth parts will go down and just kind of like sponge around on it. So when you're picnicking and it's walking around your food, just taking off little bits of stuff on your food. And then you think, oh, it was probably last on a pile of dog feces doing the exact same thing. And then you won't want to eat your food anymore because that's disgusting. But pretty cool. Okay, why are they important for humans? Well, they are very important disease transmitters. We're going to have a whole lecture on medical entomology, and we're going to talk about there's so many different flies that are blood feeders that pass diseases around for people that are pretty nasty. Drosophila has become a very, very important research tool. It's probably one of the most well-studied organisms on the planet, if not the most. Maybe humans and Drosophila, top two. And huge agricultural pests like fruit flies are really, really bad in agriculture. The blowflies and flesh flies are really important consumers of dead animals. And they're important in forensics because they can actually estimate the time of death. We're going to talk about that when we talk forensic entomology in a few weeks. Some of these maggots are used to treat wounds that contain dead tissue, which is really, really gross, but actually helpful. We may bring that back up. I'm not sure. I've already talked about Drosophila. It's an amazing model organism. It's very similar to the human. Well, it's not very similar to the human genome. It's about 60% homologous. But is cool in that it shows some similarities between us and them. My favorite example is the Tin Man gene. So the Tin Man gene, if it's mutated and wrong in Drosophila, then Drosophila is born without that. Its major aorta. It doesn't really have a heart, but remember, it has the aorta across the dorsal side of it that pumps all its hemolymph through the whole body. That's the Tin Man gene. If it's broken, it may be born without that. A human born with mutations in the Tin Man gene are born with a hole in their heart. So here's a gene between two organisms that diverged probably 500 million years ago. My hands both. They diverged in different directions 500 million years ago, and yet they have genes that serve something of the same purpose. So that's pretty cool. They're great for research, a short life cycle, easy to rear in the lab. There's lots of different mutant lines available, so they're really cool in that regard as well. Mosquitoes are the most deadly creature on the planet by a mile, and it's because they transmit so many different diseases. They take blood meals. It's only the females that take blood meals, which is important to remember. They take a blood meal before they lay eggs. Aedes, Anopheles, and Culex are the vectors for many of these human diseases. Like you can see here, Aedes for chikungunya, dengue, yellow fever, and Zika. Anopheles is malaria. Malaria is a horrible disease. We're talking 200 plus million malaria cases in 85 countries in 2021. 627,000 deaths. And that's probably up 12%, probably due to COVID problems. Okay? Oh, and then Culex I have over here, sorry. Japanese encephalitis, lymphatic filariasis, West Nile virus are all vectored by Culex mosquitoes. Mosquitoes are bad news. The mosquito lifestyle is kind of important because one of the best ways to control them is hopefully controlling them through the water stage. So they hatch out of the water, they have imago, they feed, they lay eggs. First larva stage, second larva stage, all of these are in the water. So sometimes in places with really bad mosquito problems, they consider there's some films that they can put on the water. It's toxic and not good, but it prevents them. You can see over here, they breathe through this little tube on the end of their abdomen. So if you can cut that off, they can't breathe and they die that way. I remember in one house I moved into years ago with a bunch of guys. I had one bathroom that didn't really have a sink. It had a faucet in the corner. I was in a tropical country. It's basically a box of tiles with a toilet in the middle and a little spigot for water to wash your hands. We had a big mosquito problem in that house, and as I was in the bathroom, I looked down into the bucket of water that was catching the drip off, and it was full of mosquito larvae. I'm like, I wonder why we have a mosquito problem in this house. We got to start with taking care of that. It was pretty bad news. Got to know your science, right? Chironomids are very common around here. They look like mosquitoes. They're not mosquitoes. When you see these really plumose antennae, that's a good clue that you're looking at chironomid, not a mosquito. Some mosquitoes have imposters. When I was a kid, they always called these big crane flies mosquito eaters. They're not mosquito eaters, and they're not giant mosquitoes either, but they don't bite you. They don't help you at your house at all. These are aquatic feeders as larvae, and then they just hatch out and mate. They're not eating mosquitoes, though. They're not doing anything helpful in that regard, unfortunately. Okay, that does it for the Diptera. Now on to the Mecoptera. Meco meaning long, ptera meaning wing. These are long-winged insects. Really kind of creative name there. But they do have long wings. This is a hanging fly. Really cool batacid right there. This is a typical Mecopteran. And they get their name because the male's genitalia looks just like a scorpion. It's not a stinger. it just looks like that, as you can see kind of down here. So they call it scorpion flies for short. They have an elongated head, they have chewing mouth parts. They're scavengers, some are predators. These hanging flies are the predaceous ones. Some are nectar feeders. These are some of the scavengers. These are the boreads. They live actually out on snow and ice. They have lost their wings and they just kind of hop around the ice and they eat detritus and crap that's melting on the ice. As we looked at it, there's some of these are extremely laterally flattened, and we realized that these, in the lab I was in as an undergrad, these are probably really close related to fleas. And it turns out we were right when we did the molecular work. Fleas evolved from the Mecoptera, right? So our last group here is the Siphonaptera. The fleas, so siphon meaning tube, aptera meaning wingless. So these are the wingless tube feeders, and they feed on blood of humans and other organisms, right? The adults are external parasites of mammals and birds. Only the adults feed on blood. They're laterally flattened, right? They're very flat. Let me get my orientation here. They have jumping hind legs. They jump really, really effectively. Adults can actually live for a long time, and they can live for a long time without blood if they can't get it. But they basically have the eggs, larvae, pupa, adult stage. They're typical Holometabolous insect. They are really, really bad in that they've caused huge amounts of death over the years because of spreading the plague. So mosquitoes spread a lot of things. The fleas spread the plague, and essentially what happened is they were getting it from rats, but then they were killing all the rats because of the plague, and so they needed a new host, and they started jumping onto humans, and then they would give the plague to humans, and it caused huge amounts of death across especially Europe and Asia in the early 1300s. The plague killed about 25 million people. We're going to talk a lot more about this when we talk medical entomology, but it was the Black Death, the bubonic plague. And it's not gone. We still have Yersinia pestis. We still have that bacterium. It's just kept in check much better. Antibiotics work for it because it's just a bacterium. And as long as you get it stopped early and know what's going on, you can avoid bubonic plague. All right, that's it for this lecture. I hope you enjoyed it. We'll see you next time.